The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
As Ontario gears back up, is public transportation stalled? Tonight, we get an update on the messy situation with Ottawa's LRT. Then, as the Toronto Transit Commission marks its 100th anniversary this year, we assess whether flagging pandemic-era ridership could derail big plans ahead. Also, we'll find out why something called polypharmacy has doctors and pharmacists thinking less is more. It's Tuesday, October 26th, and that's ahead on the agenda. The good news is that Ottawa Transit users could be riding free of charge on the Confederation line all December long. The bad news is that shiny new light rail transit line would have to be back in service by then. It derailed in mid-September and has been out of service ever since. Here to fill us in on the whole story from the downtown in the nation's capital, there's Joanne Chianello, city journalist for CBC Ottawa. Joanne, it's been too long since we've had you on this program. It's good to see you again. How are you?
Absolutely, yes. And I think we were talking about the LRT last time, too. So it's a story that keeps on giving over here.
That does not surprise me. Now, let's just take us back a bit and do some background here. It was the week of the LRT's second anniversary that it actually, I gather, conked out. How well was it working before that happened?
Well, you know, people might remember back when it actually launched in September of 2019. So this system is just over 2 years in public service. And it had a great first month when the buses were still running. And then, I hate to use a pun, but the wheels started to fall off. You know, a lot of problems ended up happening. And there were these famous pictures of people jumping the fence at the transit stations to get to walk through. There were pictures of just hordes of people walking down the streets when the train stopped to try to get to work. And that's because we had a huge list of early problems. I'm going to actually look at a list. They're so long I have to read it from a piece of paper. There were door jams and brake issues and switch issues. And at Christmas time, there was arcing, or what they call they call it arcing, but it's like sparks on the overhead line, which is never a good sign. And at New Year's Eve, the system shut down and stranded like hundreds and hundreds of people trying to get to parties and other places. One time a giant piece of the cable fell down, you know, and then last summer we saw that wheels were flattening out way before they should. Wheels were cracking, and that's something that the Transportation Safety Board is still investigating to this day, and they're having to replace all those wheels. And now we've come to the fall of derailments. Now, for, you know, I'd say about 8 or 9 months, the system was working okay. You know, we didn't have all 15 trains out running at the same time, but it was, you know, it didn't shut down for days at a time. That's a low bar, but, you know, it was working all right. Now, of course, it's during the pandemic, a lot of public servants here in Ottawa, so a lot of people working from home. So so there's not a lot of, you know, eyes on the street, so to speak, but it was working all right. And then in August, a train derailed, August 8th. Happily, no passengers on board. And that was the first derailment. And then it was connected to the second derailment in September, just a month later, that has shut it down for a long period of time.
And is there yet an official explanation for why that happened?
Okay, well, you end up having to be a sort of a locomotive engineer to do this job sometimes. So one of the things that happened was there was a problem with the axle bearing. You know, the axle is that bar that goes across the train, and there's 2 bearings and screws on the ends that attach the wheels to that axle. And the first time around, there was a bearing issue. It broke for some reason. It became loose and a wheel broke off. So that was in August. The folks that are in charge of this system, they investigated all the trains. They had to repair 9 of them. We're still not sure what those repairs mean, if they got new bearings or new tightening up. But what happened was one of the trains that was repaired, it turns out now that the bearing was not tightened properly. And it was also not actually written down by the maintenance people. So a train that didn't have the bearing torqued properly was sent out into service. And so on September 19th, the train derailed before going into a station. It traveled, here's some alarming stuff about this. it traveled for about 400 meters in a derailed state, including traveling over a rail bridge over a 6-lane street before coming to a stop. There was no actual signal to the operator that it had derailed. There's no way to know that. And in fact, we're not sure the train actually hit a switch control box, so sort of a piece of equipment on the side of the rail. It actually smashed into it and broke it, and that's when it came to a stop. And right now, we're not sure that if it hadn't hit that, we're not sure that that train would have ever come to a stop. So there are so many alarming questions now, and this is why this train system is on hold at least until next month, but I think that's pretty optimistic.
Now, this feels like a lot of trouble for a system that is still relatively young, and I'm sure people want answers. How either easy or difficult is it to get answers as to why things have been so uneven so far?
Yeah, it is difficult. And, I mean, things do happen on rail systems, and nothing that we've seen is something that has never happened anywhere. But the problem is we're seeing so many of them, so many problems happening in such a concentrated period of time for a system, as you say, that is so brand new. So it is really difficult to get answers because I think it's not one specific thing, right? And so I think there's a lot of people who are looking at the design of the actual system, the track. I'm hearing from people that there's some curves in the track that might make it, that might be putting extra wear and tear on the wheels, the way that it's designed. We are also hearing about the trains themselves, right? Alstom has made these trains. They're called the Citadis Spirit trains. They were supposedly designed for North America. They've never been used before anywhere but here, and they seem to have just an unending number of problems. And, the viewers in the GTA might want to take note because Metrolinx spent $500 million buying these trains also for the Finch LRT, the Hurontario LRT in Mississauga. And again, you might want to look at what is happening in Ottawa with these trains. So were these trains really the right ones for this system? There's a lot of questions about that. But it's hard to get answers because we are having to go through the city. We're getting everything sort of second, third hand. This is part of a private-public partnership with a consortium of private companies, which is SNC-Lavalin and Dragados and Ellis Don. These are all companies that are also building LRT systems in the Greater Toronto area as well. They are the ones in charge of it. We are not, as reporters, allowed to actually interview them. As part of the contract in dealing with a private enterprise in a P3, the communications lands with the city. And so we're actually never allowed to speak to the people who are running this. Alstom is a contractor. They are a train reporter. We can never get interviews with Alstom. We've never had anyone, an official from the Alstom train maker, come to City Hall to answer questions in public from councillors. And so it's really hard to get answers as well. I do think the problem is complex. So I think there's a lot of, I don't know that there's one big problem. I think there's probably a lot of issues that people are trying to work out.
Well, those are some of the transportation issues that you've enumerated there. There are also political issues related to this, and I wonder how much heat there has been on the city in general and on the mayor in particular.
Yeah, huge amounts here, and of course, because, as I said, we could have a whole show on private-public partnerships, but the idea is that the accountability really lies with the city. Sure, somebody else built it, and they are in charge of maintaining that system. But people want to know from the city, why did you accept this system, right? And there's a lot of questions that are unanswered. For example, did the city accept this system too early? Was this system tested enough? I'll give you one quick example. There was supposed to be in the summer of 2019, just before the system opened, a 12-day consecutive testing system. We heard over and over again how the train system had to work perfectly for 12 days in a row, or else the city wouldn't take it over. Well, it didn't work perfectly for 12 days in a row. There was a pause. Nobody was told about it. In fact, through some requests for information, CBC found out that the general manager for the transit system wrote a memo saying that the testing was paused for 48 hours, but that memo was never sent out. So there's a lot of questions now about was there any political pressure to get it out sooner? Why did the city accept a system that when only 13 trains were working instead of what we were always told was 15 trains instead? And there were a group of councillors and a number of people in the city, including the former mayor, Bob Chiarelli, calling for a judicial inquiry into this. Now, there was a lot of a very raucous council meeting a couple of weeks ago where people like Councillor Diane Deans was calling for judicial inquiry. The mayor turned off her microphone, so that was a big brouhaha. But in the end, Mayor Jim Watson and his supporters went for an audit instead. So the city's Auditor General is now going to look into everything from how this thing was procured, what oversight the city had, and frankly, whether they accepted it too soon. The problem is a judicial review would have gone farther than that. So the people who want a judicial review, like, as I said, Diane Deans, who looks like she's probably going to be running for mayor next year, she says, you know, what do you have to hide? The judicial review is going to be looking at whether politicians were involved, right? And an auditor general can't. So it's become super messy politically, and I would be very surprised if it is not a major election issue next year during the municipal election campaign.
And I just want to ask you about December, because theoretically, if this thing's up and rolling, it's going to be free riding in December. What's the expectation?
Yeah, I mean, they're going to just make it if they make it. I mean, the most optimistic view is mid-November. I'm talking to people who don't think that's really going to be true. It's going to be early December. But I also know people who are very nervous now about taking it. So I don't think the free ride is necessarily going to make them feel that much better, but we'll have to see.
So if the LRT is up and rolling, and if people do get to ride for free, who ultimately pays for that at the end of the day?
Well, it's interesting because they were saying the city, the mayor and his supporters said that the Rideau Transit Group, that's a consortium that actually built this line, will be paying for it. But that's splitting hairs because, frankly, we actually pay them $4 to $5 million every month to run the system. And because, of course, the system's down, we are not paying them. So we're going to take that money to pay for it. It's going to cost about $7.5 million. So we're taking the money that we're not paying them to get the system we're running and letting people ride it for free. I think people see this as something of a gimmick, but I'm sure some people will really appreciate it too.
Indeed. Joanne Chianello, city reporter for CBC in Ottawa. It's always great of you to grace our airwaves, and thanks for showing up on the agenda tonight.
Thank you for having me.
If not for a pandemic, this might have been a big, exciting year for the Toronto Transit Commission. It turns 100. But throughout the COVID crisis, ridership plummeted, operating costs didn't, and it faced some real staffing challenges. Can Canada's largest public transit system find ways to bring people back in a post-COVID recovery that may include very different commuting patterns? Let's find out from our guests, all of them in the provincial capital. At her office at City Hall, there's Toronto City Councillor and TTC Commissioner Shelley Carroll. In the annex, Shoshana Sachs, Assistant Professor in the Department of Civil and Mineral Engineering at the U of T and the Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Infrastructure. And on the Danforth, longtime transit activist Steve Munro, who blogs at the website stevemunro.ca. And it's great to have you three on our program tonight. Shelley Carroll, I'll start with you. How well, in your judgment, was the TTC serving the Greater Toronto Area before the pandemic hit?
Well, people may have forgotten, but before we were well over capacity, really crowding riders in. Most of the complaints were that while fares were going up, we didn't seem to be buying vehicles fast enough. And so we were at capacity in the bus system, in the streetcar system, and the subway system.
Steve Munro, we know that ridership has dropped drastically because of the pandemic. How much of it has come back in the interim?
Well, it went down to about a quarter of its usual height on the TTC, more so on the subway than on the bus system. It's now come back to 45 to 55%, depending on where you are. The curves have been trending upward recently, which is certainly nice to see. But the important thing is that we don't assume the TTC ain't dead yet. Is I would say the watchword. We have to look at this as something that we waited out people will come back to transit once they're working again, once they're back at school again, once all the entertainment venues are back again.
Well, we'll get into that as we go along here. Shoshana Sachs, in your view, why have the numbers, the jobs have all come back. Why have the numbers of people riding on the Toronto Transit system not come back to 100% capacity?
A lot of people are still working from home, and a lot of people are still scared to be in crowded environments. Those are things that will ease up with time.
What do you think it would take to get people to be less nervous about riding on a streetcar or a bus or a subway?
I think less COVID would help. More enforcement of the mask mandate, more universal vaccination, and more time.
Well, let's talk about the mask mandate for a second. Shelley Carroll, I know that, whenever I'm on the subway, it really is dependent on people adhering to the honor system. You haven't got lots of people running around on the buses or on the subways or in the streetcars telling people to put their masks on. We sort of are required to police ourselves. Do you think you need to use a stronger hand in that regard?
Well, that may be the case. If we should see another wave, a fifth wave, I think we may have to look at that. We are relying on the honor system to a great extent, though, because we're really struggling with that reduced ridership that Steve described. And so we don't want to take the money that's been provided by other orders of government just to keep the system running at near to 100% and then funnel it all into enforcement. At the same time, we don't want to put the operators, the drivers running the system, at risk. And so we're really counting on the community to behave like a community and keep each other safe. And we just hope that at every juncture, wherever this is discussed and whenever it's discussed, that yet more people realize we would all be safe if we just adhere to the mask mandate when we get on that vehicle.
Well, let's get Ben Spur into this. He's the transportation reporter of the Toronto Star, and he had this to say about this subject not too long ago. COVID-19 has fundamentally altered the demand for transit. According to TTC projections, for ridership to return to just 90% of pre-pandemic levels, the city's office occupancy rates will need to recover to 80% of normal. Universities and colleges return fully to in-person classes, and capacity limits on all retail and entertainment activities be fully lifted. The timetable for all those factors is uncertain, and for the foreseeable future, there will likely be fewer reasons for people to ride. Okay, Shoshana, pick up that story there. Given all of what Ben just said, how big a problem is that for the long-term future of the TTC?
I don't think it's a problem at all. We do a really bad job as humans and understanding how long infrastructure lasts for. When we're talking about the future of the TTC, we should be talking about 10 years from now, 20 years from now, in addition to 1 year from now and 5 years from now. Universities are already largely back in class downtown. They should expect to be even more back in class within not too long, unless there is another wave or another strain. All capacity limits on entertainment venues, I think, were lifted today. So things are changing really quickly, and I don't think we're processing how quickly things will continue to change. Okay,
that's a somewhat optimistic viewpoint. Shelley Carroll, what say you?
Well, I think we have another sort of potential to reach here. We were oversubscribed before. There were people avoiding the TTC because it was too crowded. What we have to do now is go beyond just an ad singing the song "Welcome Back" and really find a way to welcome back riders and to introduce new people to the system. As we come out of the pandemic, I think we have to incentivize them back. We have to look at our fare structure. We have to look at our schedules. And while we have this help from other orders of government to get to the end of the pandemic, use it to actually cultivate ridership and make sure that although our work lifestyles may be changing, that it's still our first choice mode of transportation.
Steve, can I get you to comment on the last line there in Ben Spur's piece, which is the timetable for all those factors is uncertain, and for the foreseeable future, there will likely be fewer reasons for people to ride. Agree or disagree?
Agree mostly. The big problem is that there are parts of the city that aren't back to normal. And if it's like when people talk about having stores nearby to walk to, if you're living in the middle of nowhere, there's no place 15 minutes away, as an example. That's a big idea these days, very transit and pedestrian oriented. But we have a situation where places people might go are not back fully operating again. The biggest of which, of course, is the office towers. Now, the office towers downtown might very well be used differently. People may work part weeks. The amount of floor space per worker may go down, but the total number of workers commuting may eventually level off or even grow if those towers have less space per worker, but more workers in the towers.
Well, Shelley Carroll, let me try this then. You know, we've got something on the TDC called a Metro Pass. At least I think it's still called a Metro Pass, which is a monthly, you know, and it's a good deal.
Monthly pass.
Yeah, the monthly pass. And if you use it every day, it's a good deal. But if you've got people who are going to be coming to work only half of the week now instead of the full week now, do you have to rethink that?
We do need to rethink it because, in actual fact, pre-pandemic, it was not considered a good deal. In terms of North American systems, the number of rides over and above just going to work Monday through Friday were more rides than basically any other monthly pass in the North American transit network. We really need to look at that monthly pass. We're really trying to incentivize. I would submit that we need to get down to a point of welcoming people back for a set period, perhaps for 6 months, whatever. We need to make it just going to work Monday through Friday is your monthly pass cost, and that will bring people back. That's a way of getting them back in the habit of choosing transit over Uber, transit over catching a ride here and there, but also because for people who may be taking the odd day per month to work from home. That seems to be the hybrid that some people are working to, 2 days a month, 3 days a month, you work from home. If that's the new model, then we need to account for it in the monthly pass. And the best time to do it is right now when other orders of government are funding us to run almost 100% service. That means that it's not really a loss of revenue to offer a discount on this pass, particularly not if it generates sales of those passes.
Shoshana, how do you like that idea?
I think that the cost of taking the TTC is important, but it's not the most important thing I'd like to see us be ambitious about in the future. There has been decades of research on why do people ride transit, and cost is important, so it's something we should be paying attention to. But the number one thing is, does it go where you need to go when you need it to go there? And this is something that has been a challenge with the TTC from before the pandemic. It was a challenge during the pandemic, and it'll be a challenge after the pandemic. And so I'd like to also see us be really ambitious about service and where people can go quickly on the TTC, things that we've talked about in the past, like rapid bus transit routes. I think that's going to be really important for the future. And it's not just about reestablishing what we had before, but about establishing something that's better. If people are going to be working in different ways, that doesn't mean they'll be taking less trips. It means they'll be taking trips to different places. We want to make sure the TTC goes there as well.
Well, let's take Shoshana's advice here and not look to next month, but let's look to the next decade and beyond. And to that end, the Ontario government expects the Greater Toronto Area to grow in population by, if you can believe this, more than 40% over the next quarter century. That's about 1 million more people in the city of Toronto alone. And the roads of the city of Toronto, if you've driven them lately, and I suspect most people watching this in the city have, well, they're obviously not going to be able to accommodate that kind of population growth. So, Steve, in your judgment, how prepared is the TTC to move potentially a good chunk of that many more people?
I think they're not prepared, but it's not just the TTC. Part of it is the city and the priority it gives to transit, both in terms of road space, but also, frankly, in terms of funding. One of the big problems we have is the idea that that buses have to be full everywhere. I mean, that's the attitude some politicians take. And frankly, you cannot have that all the time on every route and also have everywhere to everywhere service. We have to get away from the model that basically we're moving people to King and Bay, but we're moving people over much wider ranges. And in some cases, the bus isn't going to be packed to the roof. That's going to cost money.
Councillor Carroll, you agreeing with that?
I do. We just heard Shoshana saying what most riders say. It's gotta be an everywhere to everywhere service, and then it will always be by choice. Then I start from, can I get there by the TTC? That's my first thing that I look at. And let's face it, there will be a million more people. They're already coming in, and or growing into the people who need homes and ways to get to work and jobs. And so what we have to do is get to the point where we understand that prioritizing transit by allowing transit to use more of our roads is because we don't have more roads. And what we want is to get people to make a choice to opt out of car usage, even if it's only a certain number of days a week. We want them to opt out of their cars and onto the transit system. And in that way, we'll be able to accommodate that increased population on the roads we have. Right now, what we're living through is a lot of people who have the choice, but they're choosing car because they're still nervous about the system. And that's been a real eye-opener for us. It really has confirmed for us that it's not a system that transports just the carless. It's transporting people who have the options and they chose transit for a long time. Now we need to get them to choose it again.
Well, let me follow up with you on that, Councillor Carroll, because if you're looking at a couple going out for the evening, for example, or certainly if it's a family, it can be much more economically advantageous to take an Uber or even drive yourself than to take the TTC. How does the TTC compete with that scenario?
Well, it's one of the things that we have been looking at. I moved a motion at the commission recently to approach ridership growth in the context of we have this new competitor, which is ride sharing. We have to recognize that Uber has begun to take care of some of the short trips. I think it's part of the reason that you see as the pandemic starts to near its end, the bus system is very full, but the core city and the higher order transit where people can take a short Uber trip from one downtown location to another, that's very compelling to them. And so what we have to do is make this a high quality service, as convenient as possible, and really make it their first choice. And a lot of that is looking at the fare medium, which we're doing right now. I would submit that we need to look at the fare structure. We're also doing a 5-year fare structure review right now. These are all things in the long run over the next decade can really start to drive choice to take this system.
Steve, let me ask you about that, the fare structure, which is, you know, one of the unique selling propositions, I guess you could put it that way, for the TTC is that whether you're going one stop on a subway or you're going from the southwest end of Etobicoke to the northeast end of Scarborough, it's the same fare. That can be both a plus and a minus. Do you think that unique selling proposition is worth hanging on to?
Yes, very much. As a matter of fact, one of the big changes, you know, thinking of pre-pandemic times, when the MetroPass was introduced, it made a big difference for people who traveled frequently. The MetroPass basically set a fixed price per month, although it was high compared to other cities. It set a fixed price. More recently, we have the 2-hour transfer, which is like a mini MetroPass. You can get on and get off without having to worry about arcane rules of whether or not you pay a fare. Those are both very important in terms of not kind of nickel and diming people as they go along. There has been talk of charging by distance, and I find that rather intriguing, considering that the very people for whom transportation is most a problem, that is to say, people who are lower wage earners who live far away from their jobs, would be hurt proportionately much more, whereas someone like me who lives downtown and makes short trips everywhere, actually fare by distance would be just great. Thank you.
Shoshana, what's your view on that?
I think we're talking about only one half of the challenge, which is how much do we charge people to take the TTC? And there's another really big question, which is how much do we subsidize people to drive, which is a lot. So we can also talk about that subsidy, about prices for parking, about the discomfort of driving. I mean, often driving feels like it's going to be faster and cheaper if you look at the TTC fares, and then you get in a car and it's miserable and you're stuck in traffic and there can't be anywhere to park. That needs to be part of the messaging of why the TTC is better. Going by rapid transit is faster and cheaper. And when people remember it's faster and cheaper, they take it more often. When we're talking about how to accommodate an extra million people in Toronto and how we get them moving around, it's also a question of land use, of where do those people live. And so if we're putting all of this solely on the TTC, it's a lot of responsibility for only one part of the equation, when really the city should be looking at all of these things at the same time.
Understood. Shelley Carroll, I want to ask you the $12 billion question. And that is, if ridership doesn't come back the way that everybody either hopes or expects that it will, do we still need to spend $12 billion building that Ontario line from the northeast part down to the waterfront?
Well, I probably would have a different route underway to what the province has done. Our downtown relief line was going to serve almost the same purposes and was much further along in terms of study and ready to go. But that line is coming. And so I prefer to look at it in the reality. And there is always an ability to grow ridership. The question is, do you want to invest in doing that? And what we have just witnessed is an almost 2-year pilot now of what happens and what is the potential of a system when we get back to what we had long ago, if we go all the way back to the time of Premier Bill Davis, and that is other government partners in operating the system. That infusion has allowed us to keep going against all odds, against an employment crash and the pandemic itself. It's that infusion. Post-pandemic, we should be having a conversation with the federal government and the provincial government to say, look what was possible. Now, if we're going to get 1 million people here, we need you to stay on as an operating partner, not just a capital partner, because we need to grow the ridership so that you're not building that Ontario line for nothing. Help us make sure that we're getting people to choose their adult life to be a transit riding adult life, so that when you cut the ribbon on the Ontario line, that's the mode of travel they want.
Steve, I should get your take on that as well. Do we still need a $12 billion Ontario line if ridership doesn't come back? What do you think?
The Ontario line, or the relief line, or whatever you want to call it, is something we've needed for about 50 years, and it keeps getting pushed off the table for other projects. The only reason it wasn't built in the last few decades, it was a really hot topic in the late 80s when the subway was packed full. And then there was this little recession in the early 1990s, and all of a sudden we didn't need the relief line anymore. Well, not building it is not an option. And if anything, it doesn't go far enough. Stopping at Eglinton, well, that's nice as a first step. It should really go further north up Don Mills Road. I've always thought if it had been called the Don Mills Subway, it would have been built 20 years ago.
Shoshana Sachs, it's supposed to go from Don Mills down to the CNE. Do you think we still need it? It's a big price tag.
Absolutely. It's going to take at least a decade to build. We can't predict what the future is going to be like, but 100 years of evidence show the subway will come back. We're definitely going to need it, and we will regret not building it if we don't, just like we regret the last time we didn't build it. I think the question is, how do we make it a success? And that is about how we coordinate it with land use. This is something that Toronto used to be a world leader in, and we let that slide. When we built the Yonge line, we made sure that businesses and apartments and housing were built concentrated around the line. That's something I'd love to see around the Ontario line. It's unfortunately something we keep forgetting about, but we can retrofit that into our plans for any subway eventually if we can get our act together to remember what we used to be good at.
Well, speaking of coordination, let me follow up with Shelley Carroll on that. Coordination's a fabulous thing, but you at the city, I mean, I assume you can't really tell people where to work, where to live, where to play. How much influence can you have on those decisions? Because, of course, that very much depends on how much and where transit ought to be built.
Well, I'm a representative along the Shepherd subway line. I have all but one of the stops on the Shepherd subway, and it, quite frankly, is a shining example of what happens when you do actually, as our official plan says, prioritize a transit avenue. We have grown the population along the Shepherd line, and a line that was destined for failure actually has pretty decent ridership now. It also is beginning to take shape as a community. Its avenues are starting to become much more walkable. The retail is about to start to fill in, and that took 20 years. So you have to decide that that's what you're going to do and carry it forward. I think you're going to see a big change along the Eglinton Crosstown line, that provincial line. There are many, many applications all along its route in that say that that is where we're going to focus more residents, more employment, and really make sure that that line, once built, is viable. But that being said, we also have to take into account that people have to be able to afford to live close to that transit. And to that end, the city is right now engaged in a deep conversation about inclusionary zoning, so that not only will have the transit there for riders, hopefully the jobs, but we need to make it so that that's true for everyone, not just the CEO.
Steve, I should ask you about the Eglinton Crosstown. It's going in about, I don't know, a couple of 100 meters north of where I'm sitting right now. It's, what's the last price tag on it? $5.5, $6 billion line. How do you see it transforming the transit opportunities in this city?
I think it can be very good. I really do hope that the eastern part of it, out to Kingston Road and up to University of Toronto Scarborough, isn't deferred forever, because that was an important part of the original Eglinton project. But the thing we have to, I'm going to come back to the issue with bus services, and that is that we keep focusing on an individual line, an individual corridor. It's not something that you can do where, Eglinton will fix everything. It won't. There will still be huge parts of the city where the only thing they will ever see is buses. And it's imperative that the TTC do a better job of running bus service, which they frankly are not doing as good a job as they could right now. People complain regularly about missing buses, about buses coming in 2s and 3s and 4s. It is a situation, and that is compounded by the fact that road traffic is actually back more strongly on some streets now than it was pre-pandemic because of people who are driving.
Shelley Carroll, I think I saw you nodding your head while he was saying that. You're in accord?
Absolutely. But it's a fraught conversation. It's fraught with tension on the part of the car drivers, because when you start to talk about transit priority lanes, it's really hard to get the word out there that you've figured out a way to fit in the car lanes and that their journey is going to be changed before the hysteria takes hold. We experienced it recently in a rapid TO conversation that was about that, prioritizing some of the north-south bus routes so that we can maximize the impact of the crosstown, getting people down to them. But people zeroed in on one particular street where they don't want to see it, and we failed to have the discussion about the whole network. There already is a prioritized lane on Don Mills Road, for instance. Painting it red is not a huge change, but it underscores for people that might be trapped in a car and waiting in traffic, I could be zooming down that red lane on a bus right now. We really want to start to look at those things, and that conversation is we're underway right now with the rapid TO consultation. But we need the car drivers to really open their minds to how we can improve their car journey if we provide a better transit journey.
Shoshana, I think I know how you're going to answer this question. You're going to say it can be done because you've been very optimistic about getting people out of cars and onto transit. But honestly, truthfully, do you think you can get people who live in the inner suburbs, more of them, to consider public transit as an option for them traveling around Ontario's capital city?
Absolutely. You have to make the service really good, and you have to make it cheaper. Owning and driving a car is really expensive. It's a headache. And people only do it as their dominant mode if they don't have other good options. And this isn't just, I'm not speaking from optimism, I'm speaking from science. We are by no means the first place in the world who has wrestled with how do you manage mobility or accessibility or car use. We're not inventing this wheel from scratch. We know how to do this well, we just have to be willing to try. And there's a lot of increasing good evidence that people change their mind about travel and whether or not they want to drive or take public transit once they see the alternative. It's very hard to imagine how much better really great public transit is at serving everybody, and how much better it makes it even for drivers who, because then, the last thing you want if you're using a car is everyone who prefers to bike to be in a car, and everyone who prefers to be on public transit to be in a car. So people feel very protective of their road space, but the reality we've seen all around the world is once you actually put in a change, it's wildly popular.
Steve, in our last 30 seconds, I'll give it to you. Once we get past COVID and presumably, hopefully, once ridership does come back, do you think the TTC can build enough new alternatives quickly enough to keep up with what is anticipated to be greater demand going forward?
I don't think it's a question of building alternatives. I think it's a question of building on what's there already, running more of it, and providing better service. The idea that we need something brand new to make transit better, I think, is it's a false promise.
I want to say to people that I first met Steve Monroe in 1982 when I was a City Hall reporter covering TTC meetings, and he was a gadfly sitting in the back of those TTC meetings. And as he reminds me, he'd already been doing it for 10 years when I just showed up for the first time. It's good to see you again, Steve. People can read your stuff at stevemonroe.ca, and that's not spelled like Marilyn. It's spelled like the former Hamilton Cabinet Minister John. Shoshana Sachs from the U of T and Shelley Carroll from City Hall. It's been great having the three of you on TVO tonight. Be well, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you.
People are living longer and often better, thanks in part to medicine and pharmaceutical treatments for conditions that might have once been crippling. That can also result, however, in people taking many different meds all at once. And that's where problems can crop up. With us now to explain, in the nation's capital, Dr. Rohit Gandhi. He's an emergency physician and clinician researcher at Montfort Hospital, right near downtown Ottawa. And not only is he appearing on this program for the first time, this is his first time on television ever. So, Dr. Gandhi, it's great to have you here. How are you doing?
Thank you so much. Thanks for the warm welcome. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm terrific, thank you. And we'll make this as pleasant an experience as possible, okay?
Thank you.
Let's start with this, polypharmacy. How would you define it?
So I think polypharmacy is very classically described as an individual who's on 5 or more medications on a daily basis. But that thinking has shifted a little bit to be less about the number of medications and a bit more about whether the medications you take are actually causing you more harm than benefit.
Sure. And how prevalent would you say that phenomenon is?
Well, I think it's something that affects Canadians greatly and a lot of other wealthy nations as well. About our citizens aged 65 and older are on an average of 7 different classes of medication, which is actually quite substantial. And that becomes an issue in terms of polypharmacy, as we know that each additional drug that we take as an individual increases our risks for adverse events. So this problem, I think, as we grow the number of medications available to us in terms of pharmaceutical options, becomes quite an issue here in Canada.
Let's just sort of figure out how this happens. I guess obviously at some point you're on one drug, and then another, and another, and another, and suddenly you're on 5 or 6. I mean, how does that happen?
Yeah, well, really, there's a lot of different reasons, and I think a lot of different players involved in creating that problem of polypharmacy. A lot of care can be fractionated at times. Patients don't have a primary care physician, so they're seeking care from other providers. And when you have that type of medicine that's being employed, you end up on more medications than you might be beneficial for you. Even patients who do have a family physician but have specialists involved in their care who are focused on one system or one chronic disease end up becoming victims of polypharmacy because of all of the players involved, which at times can be beneficial. But as we age, And as we continue to add medications and represcribe them without that thoughtful act of deprescribing, we end up with a lot of medications on board.
Well, I get what you're saying, but if each medication that a person is taking is designed to tackle some difficulty that the patient is having, and they all work reasonably well together, what's the problem?
Well, that's the real question. Do they work reasonably well together? A lot of studies that are done on medications and their use for treating a disease are very tailored to that specific disease and that medication in that setting. We don't often study how medications interact with each other. And I think that's one of the sources of the problem. The other part to that is when we start a medication for a certain condition or there's a benefit at the time, that doesn't necessarily mean it holds throughout your life. As I mentioned, you may start something for, let's say, your high blood pressure, and it may be helpful to have targeted, aggressive control of blood pressure at a certain age in your life. But as we age and our physiology changes, we add more medications, as we alluded to earlier, the effectiveness of that medication might not be the same. The need to treat aggressively might not be the same. And we end up with potentially a medication that was helping us at one point, but maybe now is causing us more harm.
All right, you're an ER doc, right?
Correct.
Okay, so tell us how this sort of plays out in your personal experience when you're working in the emergency room.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's not uncommon for us to see a patient in an acute setting, grab their files, and go through a list of medications that's 10 pages long. Or we have a patient that sort of comes in with their Ziploc bag, complete with pills, old, new, expired. And so that's like a very, very visual part of polypharmacy. But of the patients we end up admitting to hospital, the ones that just can't go home, about half of them are on at least 10 medications. And we know that increases your risk of having an adverse drug event, so a side effect of your medications. And it's quite surprising. I think being on 10 drugs increases your risk about 5 times of being admitted for an adverse drug event. So in my daily practice, I'm seeing a lot of polypharmacy, a lot of medications that are unnecessary and are probably leading in an unrecognized way to admissions to the hospital due to these side effects.
Dr. Gandhi, let me just make sure I got this right. 10 medications every day?
Every day.
Multiple times a day?
Yeah, this is a problem that is not just about taking 10 medications a day and all the polypharmacy. It's, as you mentioned, just understanding how to take them, when to take them, complying with them. People even get full from having 10 medications for breakfast. So it is 10 per day.
You might have a patient, for example, who's taking 40 different tablets a day for a variety of different things.
Yes, exactly. It's not just the number, it's the number of tablets as well, right? So that's quite right, Steve.
That's astonishing. How often do you find a situation where somebody comes in and, I don't know, let's say they got a parent in their 80s, and so they're in their, whatever, 40s, 50s, 60s, and you, the doctor, says to the child of the person who needs treatment, okay, what's your mom or dad on? And they give you this quizzical look like, I don't know. How often does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, that is a problem, I think, that we see all the time. Even people on 3 or 4 medications, my parents as well, I ask them what they're on, and it's difficult. And I think it becomes difficult for clinicians as well, because right now in Canada, we don't really have a great repository to understand what medications our patients are really on and where they come from. And so when we speak to their loved ones who are trying to reconcile that for them, it's overwhelming. And we really appreciate some of those families who actually have a list in front of them. And so in the rare cases, we really do get a nice list, and some people are very much involved. But, you know, it's hard to blame the family because it's a very difficult task to not have a medical background and manage so many medications for a loved one.
Sure, but I mean, as long as we're on the topic, anybody watching this, find out what your folks are on and make a list, right? I mean, that's just common sense, so that if they get into trouble, you can give the doctor good advice and good information.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice, Steve. It's very under-recognized how important it is to have a good medical record of medications coming into hospital.
All right, then. So we've got this circumstance here where some people are on a great number of medications numerous times a day, and let's figure out, if this does become a problem, what guys like you intend to do about it. There's a term called deprescribing. What is that?
So deprescribing is a fancy term to have what we call a prescription checkup, to remove medications that are unnecessary, that aren't providing any benefit, and are potentially compounding and providing harm. So it's really the active act before we get to the hospital where ICU, where we're trying our best to remove medications that are unnecessary and simplify things for our patients while keeping the quality of their care at a very high standard.
How do you know if the drugs are unnecessary?
It's a great question, and it's probably a very complex answer because everyone's very different. And drugs, like I mentioned, are beneficial at one time in your life, but later in life, they may not be so. And the interactions aren't always studied. Now, to really understand, if a drug is unnecessary, there's a lot of criteria that are starting to creep up now. And we've had lists for years, some of them like the Beers criteria, a physician made, that sort of indicates we prescribe these drugs out of habit a lot of the time, but the indication isn't always there. We talk a lot about the number of patients we need to treat. It's called the number needed to treat, which sort of shows how many patients do we need to give this particular drug to before we see one person having a benefit, which is really interesting. But on the flip side, there's also the number needed to harm. And that means how many times do we give this medication before one person has a bad event or an adverse outcome? And really weighing these two things is the first step in helping understand whether or not this drug is actually doing us any harm and whether or not the benefit is outweighing that.
Well, let's figure out how to get out of this pickle then. No doubt it's happening, this overprescribing, because doctors do it, or patients demand it, or pharmacists go along with it. So of those three, who's most responsible for sort of turning this vehicle around?
Yeah, well, I would have to argue that all three of these parties and probably other healthcare practitioners are involved in this problem. And I think the solution, if it doesn't come from all three parties, I think that that's going to be the only real way that we're going to get a real good headway on reducing polypharmacy. I think from the patient perspective, it's very important to be an advocate for your own health. And I always physicians are stretched thin. There's lots of competing interests. And as a patient, I think it's important that we take our healthcare, we understand our healthcare, and we do things like you suggested, making a list of medications, having that available. But really to start the conversation with your family physician, to go in and ask maybe for an appointment just about deprescribing. I think having that as a first step will go a long way. But certainly the family physician has a role. They have a role in preventing these adverse events and going through medications to actually help our patients understand with time if they still need to be on them. And I think that's a visit that's very much worth having. And on the other realm of pharmaceutical, we get a lot of information from pharmaceutical companies on how to start drugs and how to give them and when to give them. But we don't have a lot of information from them on when to stop them or how to stop them. And I think the onus there also lies with that type of industry to help our physicians and our patients deprescribe.
Now, that's a great point. So you think that there's the possibility that doctors don't realize they're overprescribing simply because they put a patient on the meds, but then they don't ever tell the patient, oh, incidentally, you don't necessarily have to take this for the rest of your life. That's an issue, eh?
It is an issue. And I think at times, prescriptions expire, right? So you go back and you renew your prescription every 3 months or 6 months. And I think that's an important task. And it's sort of become something that we do routinely. But I think what we need to do, as you sort of alluded to, was to really, after a certain number of years, have check-ins or reminders that we really need to revisit whether this medication is worth it. And I think patients need to sort of ask their physicians, how long do I need to be on this for? And can we talk about this in 2 years or 3 years, or whatever interval is necessary for that particular disease process and medication?
In which case, let's finish up on this. Patients get meds from a variety of different places. You can get meds at a walk-in clinic. You can get them from your GP. You can get them from a specialist. So again, all these players have a role to play, presumably, in this drama that you're describing for us. Do you see a quick and dirty solution to turning this thing around?
Well, I wish I did. And to compound the problem, there's also over-the-counter medications. So it's not just from prescribers. It's patients themselves that may take an over-the-counter medication that maybe has little harm, but compounded with your 10 medications can do a lot. So in terms of a quick and easy solution, there probably isn't one. I think we need to first have a system in place where we can access patient medication information in a very uniform way. So all providers can see that and access that, which doesn't exist today. But I think, putting on the radar prescribing and overuse of medications on patients and physicians' radar is important, and having the tools to educate them to deprescribe, which we know is a time-sensitive, time-consuming, and complex process, would really help. A lot of my particular research that I do in the hospital has to do with providing physicians with individualized data on their performance, and actually allowing physicians to use data compared against their peers who practice in the very same setting as them to really understand, through audit and feedback, how much, let's say, each of their prescriptions on average are per patient they have, and providing that information in conjunction with education is probably where I think we're going to see the mark move a little bit, because we know that education alone and information alone doesn't really change behavior in a lot of different studies and cases in medicine. And we need to complement that with other things like audit and feedback and understanding really the motivation on why you need to change, and we need to help our patients to do so.
Well, having said that, let's hope we've done a little piece of that educational part of this puzzle here tonight on TVO. Dr. Rohit Gandhi from the Montfort Hospital in Ottawa, I want to not only thank you for being with us on TVO tonight, but I also want to tell you, you were excellent. First time on television, and you were terrific. So thank you, and I look forward to speaking to you again about whatever you're interested in as it relates to our healthcare system.
Of course. Thanks a lot for having me, Steve. I appreciate it.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, October 26th, 2021. Tomorrow, we'll debate a proposal to introduce ranked balloting in future provincial and municipal elections. Also, we'll get a glimpse of a new documentary about the legendary Canadian jazz great Oscar Peterson. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.